Hey guys, John Martini here from jokermartini.com, and I'm here today to show you a video on the new tool I'm releasing called Labyrinth. There's a lot to the tool, so what I'll do is I'll give you guys a general overview of how it works, and then I'll show you a few examples of ways to use this tool in production. So to get started here, I'll pull up my first set of objects. So I have some geometry objects, some helper objects, and shape or spline objects. Now to create Labyrinth, you'll go to the Shapes panel and then create Labyrinth. Now when you click with Labyrinth, it will generate the icon in the center of the grid at the origin. And to begin, what you'll first do is you'll add nodes to the list here. Now you can either pick them individually, or when you hit the pick button, you can select H on the keyboard and that'll bring up the selection list. And here you can quickly and easily add multiple objects at one time. So what happens when you add those to the list is a spline will get generated through those objects. And how that gets generated is what I'll go over. So first you'll see location, and that controls the placement of the points being generated for the spline, and in this case I'm using pivot. And what that does is it uses a pivot from every node in the list as a not location for the spline. So you can change that to be centers, which is based on the bounding box of each object. You can do verts, and then lastly we have surface. Now for any object that doesn't have a surface, such as a point helper, a camera, or an omni light, or lights in general, it'll use just the pivot. Spline shapes, it will take into account surface, and what it does is it will use the knots on the spline shapes as the surface. Next we have order, and order controls the way the points generated on the location are sorted. In this case we have order, so what it does is it will go through each node, and as an example we use pivots. It'll use the order of the list to generate the order of the knots on the spline. So we can change that to random, distance, which will be the next closest object or point, and that's more visible, say if you do verts, and you'll see it'll start at one point vert and find the next closest vert, and so on, going through all the objects. And you can get some cool tech looking patterns if you turn off smooth here. And then next we have radar, and for those of you who are not familiar with how radar sorting works, if you watch, what's the show called here, let me think, Deadliest Catch, it works like the radar in Deadliest Catch. So for those of you who don't know what that is, let me show you. So say we have a bunch of teapots in the Bering Sea here. Radar sorting would put them in an order like this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in reverse clockwise order, and there's a reverse order here, so you can flip it if you need to. Lastly, we have the position sorting, so position X, Y, and Z, and that's based on, obviously, the axes. And that's the general controls for the location and ordering. Next, we have the number of splines, so say you're doing, we'll say, surface and random. When you do multiple splines, it's more visible, but in some cases, based on the settings you have, you might not be able to see multiple splines, which like this setup, so be aware of that. Next is random seed, so if you'd say you use random, and that's how random seed works. Next we have range. Now range controls, kind of think of it as percentages of the spline being generated. So if we'll say 0% to 80, we're only seeing 80% of the spline that's being generated. And what you can do is also use the offset, which that's more apparent if we do ordered, and you'll see it moves it along the generated points. Now these controls in the range area are animatable, as well as the controls under the draping effect as well. Now I'll switch this back to 100 here. And if you turn off loop, what it does is when the spline hits the last point in the ordered list, we'll say, it won't go back around and continue through the points again. It just stops. Whereas if you have it on, you'll see it loop back around. So that effect is very cool and can be very helpful. The surface points, that will control the number of points generated on the surface, and that'll be more apparent later on in the video when I show you some ways to use that. You can override it though, and what that does is instead of generating a number of points on the surface based on every polygon, you can specify, okay, 300 points. And now there's 300 points being generated for each object here you see, and they're probably overlapping a bunch here. And then the spline, for spline shapes, it'll divide the spline 300 times and generate points along it. And just to clarify, it doesn't actually modify the object it's being generated on. You'll see the circle still has just the typical 4 points here, and I'll turn that on to show you. And then the last control we have is draping, and I'll turn surface off and go back to pivot and turn on draping, and you can turn on smooth and you get a very cool like suspended cable effect. And these controls are also animatable. So there we go. Now one of the biggest effects or features, I guess, of Labyrinth over previous tools I've made, such as Cobwebs, is this tool generates not only a spline, but also points along a spline that are essentially rigged. So you can move these objects and have the spline follow. And you can animate these objects and the spline will follow. The spline will also work on rigged characters. If you generate a spline, say on a character, you want to make him look like he's wrapped in cables. It allows users to quickly throw down IK chains, or you can use this as a path deform, because Labyrinth is built on the base core class of shape inside of Max. So anything you can do with a regular spline shape, you can do with Labyrinth. And I'll show you that here next. So we'll keep Labyrinth visible here. I'm just messing with my layers here off screen. So we'll clear this out. And I'll add all these objects here. And since I want this to continue and close off, what I can do is pick this last node again. Whoops, wrong one. There we go. And then what I can do is I'll pick this shape, which is just a star shape I made. And we'll go to Compound Objects and choose Loft. And then what we can do here is get the path. And then we'll have to zero out all these so it lines up. And then we'll give it some more tessellation here. Let me change my selection settings here. And then what I can do is adjust, we'll say the twist value, and put 3000. And we'll go a little bit higher, 6000. And we have a very cool, almost like a rope effect that you would see at the Oscars maybe. And then don't forget, you can move these objects. It makes setting up, some scene layout much easier. You don't have to spend a lot of time rigging and setting up all kinds of complex spline rigs to make this type of effect. And that's just an example of a way to use Labyrinth. And you can go in here and still adjust, if you want to make some fine-tuned settings, maybe you don't want to drape it that much, or you want to turn it off entirely and maybe make a ranch for some horses. Just an idea. And we'll delete the loft here. So for the next effect, I would like to show you. Let me reset this here. So next I'll show you how it works with spline shapes. And this is just one spline set up here. It's just one node. I'll quickly add it to the list and then use surface. And right now it's generating a spline knot for every knot in the spline shape it's generating on. So we can override that. We'll say we'll do 50 points. Turn on draping, and we'll turn off the smooth for the main points and turn on smooth for just the draped points. And we'll adjust it here. And then what's cool is, don't forget, we can animate the offset, so you could make it look like it's dancing along this spline like a chandelier almost. And then if you turn off loop and you animate that effect, you can have it essentially, you know, unwind or animate along that path as well. We'll go one more just to finish it. So it's another cool effect. Next, I will show you the particle support we have. So if you have a particle system that's generating, you know, points over time or all at once, Labyrinth will support that as well. And we'll pick, we want verts, which is equivalent to the points generated in a p-flow setup. And you can also use offset here. And you'll see as the points move in p-flow, the spline gets generated. And you can still use the draping effects here. Those still work, or you can turn it off. One thing I do like to do is turn off draping and then do distance. So it sorts the points based on distance and then runs the spline through it. And you can get some very cool effects here. You could turn on smooth. You know, you just mess around with it and try different things. You get some very cool effects. So we'll remove the particle system. The next thing I have to show you is just some surface controls with geometry objects. So right now I have verts. We'll change that to surface, turn off the smooth, and we'll override it and say 300. Enable some draping, get some, you know, maybe some spiderweb effects. And then say, I want to build a box. Well, you can go in here and keep building this geometry out and watch your spline shapes be updated automatically to fill the surface and generate the points across it. We'll close it up here. Maybe add a cut and move it down. And there we go. Some splinage across the surface. So here's a few bonus material things I wanted to show you guys. We'll go back to the rope setup we were using previously, and we'll add all those nodes back in here. And we need to change it from surface to pivots, and we'll do ordered. And then a very cool effect here, we'll keep this looped in here, is you can use the multiple splines, and each multiple spline, or each spline, gets a random seed. So, you know, a random value from negative 0.5 to negative 11 is being the position generated to control the draping effect. And that random number is being generated for each spline. And that's why you'll see, you know, they won't be overlapping each other exactly. So you can get some very cool, you know, cable or power lines very quickly and easily. Next, what I'd like to show you is the fact that Labyrinth, like I said earlier, works on surface deformations and animated objects. So we'll move all those. We'll click this here and we'll make a little bit more tessellated. And we'll do verts. We need to turn off draping, even though it may look cool. And we'll do distance. There we go, click our spline here. Let me reduce it to 1, and then we'll pick the geometry and do noise. Lower the scale, up the value here, and you'll see the effect that you can get with that is a very cool, you know, almost tech-like pattern. And don't forget, you can animate this node and the spline's going to stay attached to it. So it's a very cool effect. You know, you can also do ordered, so it's based on the order of the verts, which in this case seems very scattered. You know, just a few things I'd like to show you, and there's a lot more that you can do with this tool, and I'm sure you guys will think of things that I didn't think of. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to leave a comment. This tool is not finished by any means. It's going to continue to grow, and I'm sure you guys out there will have some future requests, but I look forward to seeing what you guys can make with it, and thank you.